Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that this talk is taking place on stolen land. Both Daniel and I are speaking from the lands of the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung peoples of the Kulin Nation. I want to give my respect to elders, past, present and emerging. Sovereignty has never been ceded here. I also want to acknowledge the rich tradition of storytelling in First Nations cultures and honour all First Nations storytellers, past, present and emerging. Thanks so much, everyone, for tuning into this Toolkits live talk. I'm Brayden Gilmartin, and I'm a poetry facilitator for this season of Toolkits. I'm a poet, and I'm also an occasional poetry editor. In 2023, I was guest editor for Tell Me Like You Mean It, a collection of work of young and or emerging poets published by Australian Poetry and Cordite Poetry Review. My first poetry book is titled Strange Animals and was published in 2022. I am very thrilled to be speaking this evening to a fantastic poet, poetry editor, and also a good friend of mine, Daniel Ward. Daniel Ward is a poet and musician. They are the editor of No More Poetry, an independent publisher of poetry books and art magazines. Their second and most recent poetry collection is titled Eternal Delight Paralysis. Daniel is currently writing their third book, titled Lavender Poems, generated primarily through automatic writing exercises, sensory rituals, and walking meditations. Daniel is a founding member of the experimental sound collective Bodies of Divine Infinite Eternal Spirit. For those of you who aren't familiar with Toolkits, Toolkits Connect is a 12-week program for writers aged 30 and under to develop their skills in a unique and exciting online environment. Toolkits is run by Express Media. Express has been around for over 30 years, developing, supporting, and promoting young writers through workshops that develop skills, through opportunities for constructive feedback and publication, like VoiceWorks, and through awards and programs that recognize excellence. Toolkits Connect is generously supported by Copyright Cultural Fund, as well as Australian Poetry. And this session will be available on YouTube as a resource, and it will be captioned in the coming days. If you'd like to ask any questions during the session, you can do so via Twitter using the hashtag EMToolkits or via the live chat section on YouTube. And we really encourage questions if you'd like to be a part of the conversation. Hi, Daniel.
Hello.
Welcome.
Thanks, Brayden. Thanks for having me.
I'm very stoked to have you. So Daniel, you are a poet and you're also a poetry editor of your own established press. So I kind of want to talk about both of these things, but I thought we'd start with your poetry practice. So what made you start writing poetry and what makes you continue writing it?
As far as starting, I mean, the fact that I'm alive, that is why I write. It's definitely why I started writing. I think it probably felt like a fairly natural and like innate way to just put thoughts somewhere. And that's definitely how it started. And then, I fell down a number of holes of poetry, of like the kinds of poetry I like, and that's informed the rest of it and how it's continued. Like writing poetry was an entry point to writing music for me. But I mean, it started by just a way of documenting thoughts, more or less. I think thoughts that arrive anyway. Like I'm very conscious of the fact that poetry is where I put a lot of my ideas and thoughts, concerns, pain, confusion, joy. Like it served that function from the very get-go. And then as far as turning that into like a document that maybe I could share, that'll be a lifelong process of what poetry looks like to me, I think. It's become it's become a spiritual practice, I guess, for a bunch of different reasons. But more or less, it's kind of just I'm in great debt to poetry because it's something I get to process life with.
Mm.
And it's remained that since it kind of started, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Touching on what you said about sort of putting, like, poetry as this vehicle to kind of like put your thoughts and your emotions and all this like internal experience, and then that goes into the poem. What is your experience of like then reading the poem and then having, I guess, that reflected back to you?
Yeah. I think it's good to hate my own poetry and think it's wrong at a later date. In fact, I'm very into that, and I see. I don't know. I've committed to poetry being lifelong, and so I'm maybe less concerned with perfection in a particular kind of way. It's more about the process of it and like kind of what poetry can give me every day. That the poems just like thoughts are passing, and so I would like to think I'm open to being proven wrong by time and ideas. And I think poetry kind of keeps you accountable to that in a sense, because you do reread your own work, because ideas do shift and change. I find it hard to be stubborn.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm very open to reading work years later and disagreeing with it. I think that's really cool.
It's like having a
Yeah,
conversation with yourself.
kind of, and also the whole world, because I
Yeah.
know that like also, I mean, I think I write poems like dependent on like what I'm also absorbing, you know. I read a lot
Yeah.
and that's why I write a lot. So and I think we're all extremely kind of easily influenced by the culture that we take in, whether that's like literal books or like the conditions in which we live and the people we see and the like social circles that we engage in and the news that we read. You know, we are sponge like, I think. So
Very much so. Yeah. We don't
yeah, or
live.
I wish for poetry to be like that. I can't remember which friend of mine suggested that they wish to live like an antenna, but I've held that sentence in my mind ever since.
I love that. I love that.
Yeah.
And I also love like the idea of living like a sponge.
Yes, indeed.
So your poetry has always struck me as having this bold honesty.
Mm.
And this is perhaps a bit of a philosophical question, but I
Yeah.
wondered what your thoughts are on the relationship between poetry and honesty.
Yeah. Bunch of different angles, I guess. I guess in the moment, I feel like it's when I'm writing it, in the act of like writing it, it feels like I'm trying to be honest, or something, kind of. But then when rereading it, you notice that like there are all of these kind of your own like mental blocks or fears or embarrassments that make you change the way you speak about something, even if it's about something that really happened. And even when you do document it in a way that, because I mean, yeah, a lot of my writing, I guess what you're touching on is like about me and my life, or at least it's written in that lens, even if it's about something else, which is unavoidable. I think that's why I like poetry. But even when it feels honest, I think later down the track it's not. And it's also language is inherently, I think language has a really difficult time in being honest, to take your point philosophically, I think, and also literally. I think like we use language to try and funnel meaning, to try and be clear, to try and like explain something, or to try and like expand on something. And yet that language then gets interpreted by people who have completely different understandings of each word you've used, You know,
Mm-hmm.
sure, we have a similar understanding of words, but like the second I let go of them, they become all of these new like truths. And so like they don't remain honest. And I'm happy with that. It kind of relates to earlier, like I'm happy for truths to shift and move. And so in that, like but striving to write honestly, I don't know. It's interesting. I mean, why do you, what feels honest about it to you? I'm interested, maybe. Sorry to.
No, I think that, well, I found what really interesting what you said about language and this idea of, you know, it being kind of not being able to really grasp ever at like reality and our lived experience. But at the same time, like when I think about language in our day to day, so the way that we speak or write in prose, maybe not like creative prose, but just regular prose, it's like we're following these systems of rules that like try and aim at coherency. But poetry is not trying to do that. You know, like poetry is like, fuck that. So in a way, like poetry is more honest to like the incohesiveness of our like
I
living.
agree. That's, I think, why I like it. And I think that's why it appeals to me as a modality to like express. And that's why it makes sense, is because there's like a looseness. It can be associative. It can be abstract. It can be confusing.
There's space for gaps in meaning, like as there is literally space on the page for gaps as well.
Yes, totally. I'm interested in, I'm reading right now, I'm reading The Power of Words, which is a book by Simone Weil. And like, I think maybe it's just because I'm reading her that I'm like scared of words all of a sudden or something. But she speaks about this idea of like an impersonal truth that it seems to be like a strive for like art and writing that goes beyond an individual I experience and goes beyond a collective we experience, but is rather like the kind of shared spirit of all things. And I'm interested in that. And I guess she's interested in ways in which art may do that. And I think in many ways that's the ultimate goal, is to try and write to that. And so I think I fail every time. And that's okay, but I'll keep trying. Do you know what?
I mean, I don't think that you do, from somebody who reads your work. Speaking of your work, do you want to read one of your poems?
Yeah, should I read from the new book?
Yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, maybe I could give some context of how I write the poems.
Please do.
Maybe I can read them, and maybe I think context will help. Context, I'll give the tiniest bit of context, and or maybe I'll elaborate after. Like, I'm interested in poetry that writes within certain constraints. It's kind of the school of a kind of a bunch of different poets I like, but Oulipo, like the French movement in the 60s, I'm really interested in them. They would write, for example, like whole books without the use of one vowel, or writing at certain times of the day. Poets like Bernadette Meyer, and Leanne Brown, and that kind of school of poets where they write at particular times of day or particular parts of the month. Or C.A. Conrad uses somatic rituals. So I'm interested in like setting a condition to then write within, just to see kind of what arrives and what happens. And so for this new book, the first 50 poems I wrote as a walking meditation that I would do. And I mean, in Nam, we have a lot of lavender bushes in the fronts of people's yards and fences and stuff. And I would go for a walk every day for 50 days. And when I would stop at the right kind of piece of lavender that just kind of had an energy about it or something, I would stop and like smell it. And then I just write the poem there. So it would be this kind of sensory kind of parameter. And then I did another kind of 2 sets of 50-day rituals, which are different. But I'm going to read the first 2 poems that I wrote for the first 2 days of the first ritual that I did.
Amazing.
1. Today, the lavender is incredible medicine, alarming and eucalyptus. Today, you remind me of something that needs diluting, which is a form of slowing. Today, you are thanked for a reminder of the breath. Today, lost in the water is a young woman. She is looking at her muddy shoes in the stream of rain along the leafy road. She knows God in so much as she stops and is for a moment. I write the poem. The woman in the good firm jacket who walks quickly past will want my ripped jeans next month, and I will want her sureness. The woman who is still staring at the water and the spirit begins a dazed exit and movement towards the gate. Heaven existing in earth, she says silently, her husband in gardening pants ushering her inside. I'll read 2. I think make a whole ego today. With the lavender, you greet dream 1, dream 2, eventually recognizing mirrors you see yourself in every day. Then the whole becomes of itself, and only when you and the person you pass on the footpath are O-P-E-N to it, existing, and O-P-E-N again, again, again. Roughly 1,000 opportunities today in the busy city. You don't say it, but find that overwhelming, so you don't thank the woman collecting wrappers along the creek. Today she is our lavender that makes us stop to say our ohms. Stay golden, my sister, even if just selfishly to confirm my here-ness, my her-ness as my harness. For when I walk back in my rehearsal life of the missed opportunity of her, the mystery of her, the many meters to meet her eyes, even as a dream, I like to think I matter more than her rubbish. Loved tokens and carriers, butchered matter to purple wrap, the dropping feeling of shore or acceleration or combustion as to lose control may temporarily heal. In the testing joy of my rehabilitation ombre in violet crumble cryptogram, we said we would paint the room blue. Imagine that blue, a room for living. All the body asks for is ... And so later that day with you hungover, I buy an old blue shirt to celebrate life. Thank you. That's the 2 of them.
I love these poems so much. Because like you sent me these poems and I just had so many thoughts about them, but it actually kind of links to what you were saying about earlier and finding this kind of like connection between all things. Because I feel like both of these poems kind of speak to this idea of like actively moving against isolation and individualism kind of caused by this living in a neoliberal world. Sure. And I love like some of these lines, open to existing and open again. Just this like continual process of being open to others and and kind of not falling into the traps of being isolated.
Yeah, it's also I feel that it's also, funnily enough, feels more of like a noticing of the traps, because I'm a victim of the traps of neoliberalism or isolation and individualism too. And like that's partly the position of the poet in all of the poems too, you know. It's like I'm somewhat removed, and like although I have a desire to, you know, there is like a burning hole of love in me, as there is everyone that connects us all, there are all of these like bizarre barriers that or illusory barriers that stop us from engaging.
Yeah.
Or honoring and like celebrating that love, you know, which is,
well, then I wondered about, sorry.
No, you go.
I just wondered about then the kind of potential for poetry in like establishing a sense of connection to strangers. Because of the way that, you know, you relate to this woman in the first poem and in the second. Yeah.
Yes. I think it has probably done for ever. The poetry has served that, even in a way of like reading it, we feel more connected. Like in reading certain poems, we feel more connected with people in general. And like, that's like, I think music plays a similar role. And it's no wonder that like poetry and music are the kind of unifying elements of all like spiritual practices. It's like, there's a reason, because it's such a great carrier for narrative, and narrative gives us perspective on our own lives and the lives of all the people around us. Like there's literally, I'm in my work office right now, but I have this quote, this James Baldwin quote that I love. I'm going to read it because it just relates too much. You think your pain and your heartbreak are unprecedented in the history of the world, but then you read, it was books that taught me that the things that tormented me most were the very things that connected me with all people who were alive, who had ever been alive. Like that's the point, really. I think that I think poetry has a real potency and potential to do that.
So what do you feel like poetry, how does poetry kind of sit within like a neoliberal world?
It continues. It continues.
Because to me,
it's in total. I'll say again.
Oh no, I was just gonna say, to me, it kind of does. It feels like a threat or something in a great, in like the best possible way. It's sort of like, yeah.
I mean, as far as, I mean, it's interesting because it kind of operates in two ways. It's like, and this is kind of how I see poetry has two kind of clear functions, especially in, there's the writing of it, and it has a really clear function of the writer's own catharsis, problem solving. But then there's like a pivot towards an audience, and that's publishing. That part of it, the second part of it, is totally caught up in neoliberalism. You know, we engage with the market in a particular way because that's kind of what we have available to us. But it doesn't take away any of this power, which is the function of poetry for an individual as a writer and as someone you may share poetry with. Like, I mean, the way, that's what I think, actually. Yeah, that's just straight what I think. I think it is a threat to all forms of isolation, all forms of kind of like of stubborn ideology, or all forms of like isms in general.
Yeah. Well, that links quite well into what I wanted to talk about next, which is your publishing work. So you are the editor of No More Poetry Press. Do you want to give a bit of an intro for those who are listening, into what No More Poetry does?
So we've been running for like, I reckon, almost 4 years now. We're just about to put our 24th book out on Sunday. I know. What is it? I mean, it started as a publishing press because I just wanted somewhere to put my own poetry, and I had a book of poems. And then I chatted to my friend Joshua Edward, who I run the press with. It's just the two of us. And they designed the book, and we decided on paper stock and the size and the color and all those beautiful decisions of like housing a poetry book. And it just kind of snowballed from there, I guess. I mean, we've worked on a kind of 50-50 of like, I've engaged with poets that I want to work with, and that's poets within like a community here, or when I was living overseas, like in Berlin, and then the other kind of 50 is about open submissions, and that's something we've like gained a lot of friends from. So people submit whole manuscripts of books, and it's literally just me going through those submissions that we get every year and deciding what we want to publish. We focus primarily on like people who are trying to publish their first book of poetry, not exclusively, and also not exclusively queer writing, but that's just because that's one, the kind of community I'm within, and therefore kind of where we sit, but also we seem to attract a lot of queer writers, let's just say, and I'm also interested in them. So that's also a part of it, but it's certainly by no means a limitation. We work with all kinds of poets. But 24 single author poetry books. One book was a collaboration of two poets, but more or less it's single author poetry books that we publish. We do a newsletter every so often, and some art magazines and some art books as well, but primarily it's poetry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So as an editor, what kind of poetry do you find yourself drawn to publishing?
Yeah, it's interesting because like as much as I could give some kind of insight as to like being an editor, and like I'm sure I'm talking to people who want to submit to editors of different kinds or to presses of different kinds. It comes down to like it does come down to taste in the end. You know, I have a particular kind of taste. Actually, let me clarify that. In a context of a small press where it's just us running it, I gravitate to working towards work that's either going to really challenge me or that aligns with my own taste. Do you know what I mean? But as a general comment, I think, what kind of poetry am I looking for? I can tell you what I find, the kind of poetry that gets submitted that I feel like is not ready. And I think that's kind of back to that earlier idea of like, I think poetry has this fundamental strength and function as a form of catharsis, of cataloging life, of recording sensations and the beauty of them and the pain of them, and relationships and love and loss and pain. And so many things can be housed in a poem, and we can put so many things there. And for some people that's painting, and for some people that's singing, and for some people it could be anything. It's gardening, it's walking. That poetry has that absolute function, and I believe in that function so deeply. But then once you have that, then there is the question of what use is this to share, you know, and that's what publishing is. Publishing is making it public. So like, what use does this have here if I were to show it to these people over here? That's the question I would say for people to kind of, that maybe people should be considering when looking to publish their work. And so that, in the sense of like, okay, yes, here is pain, and here is a poem about it, let's say. What does it do with pain? What can it tell us about pain? How can it entertain us about pain? How can it lighten us about pain? How can it experiment with the idea of pain? Why is it that we should listen to this poem about pain? And that's impersonal to the sentimentality of the poem's relationship to the poet. And it doesn't take any of that away from, you know, to be too sentimental with a piece. I don't know. It's got to serve another function.
Yes.
If you want it to be published in public, I think. And sometimes that's really simple to achieve. Sometimes a simple observation on pain is like just enough, and it works. But yeah, so I look for work that kind of is doing at least two things at once.
That reminds me of a conversation I was having in our workshop recently. We were looking at form and playing with form, and like traditional forms.
Yeah.
And I feel as though form, like when we're looking at kind of, traditional poetic forms, like the sonnet or things like this, that they sort of sit within their cultural or social reality of the time that they were made. And they can't really be extricated from that reality. And so they kind of hold historical politics and also like, that kind of social reality. So using them now like is inherently political, is sort of what I was trying to say in this class. And so it's like when we use these kind of forms now, it's like what you were saying of kind of asking that question, like why am I engaging with this form? And if it's, and like that's why I think using form is really exciting, because you can engage with those things.
Yeah.
But if you're not engaging with them, if you're not actually having a conversation with it, then like then it can sort of feel a bit like dated.
Yeah, I think it's a reason why I think people reading and sharing their work with other people is the most important thing you can do, because then you're kind of forced to kind of stand up for the things that matter to you in a poem. And if you can defend them, then, you know, always being open to criticism. But like there are certain things that you probably don't want to like compromise on. And like I think that's a good way of like working out what that is. And I think with form, it's interesting because every poem is responsive to the forms that preceded it. Like we saw at the turn of like, you know, the 20th century, it's like that modernism became this new force that pushed against like the forms you speak of, like more traditional forms of poetry, like rhyme and meter, and there were poets who were frustrated with the institution of that, and so wanted to push against that. And you know, then later, even you know, different shifts into like postmodernism and stuff. Like it's always like a response to the current, whatever that is. And you're constantly in a dialogue as a poet or something, because there is such a lineage and history of how it's done. And in many ways you can do whatever you want, but like doing whatever you want is always still in response to what's happened. And so I agree that form is interesting for that same reason, because it's like, who's using it, why are they using it, why was it used, why are you using it now? Can't say I used it much though.
So how important, so I'm thinking about, you know, I'm thinking about when we met, and which was a long time ago now, and how many readings we've been to together, and how many events which, you know, friends have put on, and just the community that we've been a part of. So how important do you think poetry community is for, you know, for writers?
Yes, super important. Really important, but to not be discouraged if it doesn't feel like it comes easy. And also, I mean, I found a lot of my community of poets through non-poet, like poetry spaces also, and or collaborating with other kinds of artists, you know. I'm engaged in music scenes, and I find poets are everywhere, you know, and so it is kind of a disjointed thing. But there are points, like you say, like we certainly exist within a poetry community, which is like beneficial to have peers who are also working on stuff, and you're able to kind of collaborate with and workshop stuff with. The value of a poetry community into your writing is the workshopping, 100%. And even if that's just a small group of friends. But to be honest with you, I would suggest that working with non-poets is just as important as working with poets on art making, for sure. And I found that like that's been the most beneficial work I've done with my own writing, is working with non-poets. I do a lot of work with like artists and like painters and stuff, and that's like writing to their work. And the reason I think it's valuable is because you can learn from each other, but also you're putting your work to someone who is less comfortable with poetry. I think, So I don't know. I found community for poetry like certainly happens, and we have readings and stuff, but there is a broader way of looking at what a poetry community might be, or like what community might be able to bring to your poetry.
Rather than seeing it as a sort of isolated community.
Because I mean, I wouldn't want to set up this like aspirational like desire that like there are thriving, big, enormous poetry communities out there with like lots of presses and lots of places to submit, and you know, like it is a quiet art form. Like it's not. It certainly has got like more of a boost recently, but like, and it'll constantly do that forever. Like poetry will have its, like culturally, I mean, like as a cultural art thing. So yeah, I don't know. It's a very terrible way to answer your question. I'm sorry.
No, it was a great way to answer my question.
Like sometimes I feel disconnected from a community, and then sometimes I feel very, very engaged with it. And it's funny. It's like, but I guess what I maybe want to more so point out is that like I actually felt the lack of a community, which is why I just started the press also. Do you know what I mean? And then that became like a point at which like community could kind of spread out. And so like I did that from a pure, like from a lazy standpoint of like if people come to me and I can network. A network can grow from just people knowing each other, which has happened, which is nice.
Yes. On that, how do you think writers who perhaps don't feel they have access to a literary community or a poetry community, or maybe like live kind of in rural areas or something, how do you think new writers can build their own community?
Interesting. Very, very hard question. I think probably bouncing off what I've said already, in that like don't expect it to come in the form of a clear-cut poetry community. It will come in the form of a whole bunch of different kind of artists and non-artists that you engage with in the world. But
I do love how No More Poetry kind of spawned from you wanting to publish your own work. You know, like you sort of, instead of...
Yeah, and I guess, that's the point. Just do it, I guess. And like, it's kind of easy, and you can just do it. You might have to save up for a few months to like be able to print it, but like I think also like people will flock to things that they like. People are interested. People want to be engaged with art and writing and poetry and music, even if like they don't overtly read poetry. And that's the thing actually I found with like a lot of our events is like we have a lot of the time at our readings like people who have never gone to one before. Like that's a big thing. They just come because it's a friend who's doing a thing, and then people start questioning their interest in poetry. But so just starting for us was the integral thing. Was just like, oh, I'm impatient in all of the submission places I've submitted my work. I want this book done, and I just want to like seal it off so I can start working on new stuff. I'll just print it. Let's see what happens there. Take a risk. See what happens.
And it can't be underestimated. Like I feel like emerging writers need to know that it can't be underestimated how hard it is to get your work published. Like 100%. It's not easy. So if you're not getting your work published, like that's no reflection on your work.
Some of my greatest, like, exactly, 100%. And also a lot of the time, like even in our own press, like we get through like 100 submissions of books a year, and like we only have the money to do 8. So like that's just the nature of it. And like you're right. It is really, really, really hard. But like some of my favorite poets are all self-published.
Yeah.
I love Pio. I love like D.A. Levy. I like freaks that like self-published and just printed stuff and just like gave it to the world.
Exactly. Not like waiting for somebody else to approve your work for you.
Yeah. Friends are waiting to hear your poems.
Yeah.
Doing readings is good. Doing readings in association with music, doing writing in association to art. Like I think collaboration is a good way to kind of network into a community. I think collaboration is key, like the most important thing. Because you find that there's other places to put poetry that isn't even the literary space. You know, like I didn't expect that I would end up like writing show text for people's like exhibitions. That is not something that when I went into writing, I thought that's what I really want to do. It turns out I really love doing that. It's one of my favorite things to do. But it's like that's actually that line of work is what's got me the most pay and also the most like publishing actually is like non-literary spaces, like art spaces. So yeah, it exists in many different ways. Poetry's everywhere. Like, you know, the ability to utilize whatever you learn from poetry, you can do that anywhere.
And just building it yourself. Like I remember when Kiara and I like really wanted to do readings at one point, and we were like, but there's just like nothing going on. This was a while ago now. We didn't feel like there was anything on, and so we were like, oh no, but why don't we just start, like, why don't we just hold a reading? So we did, and then that became Evening Swim, which was a reading series we did for a little while. But I think it's if you haven't like hosted events or these kind of things, sometimes you might think it's like that there's a lot involved and it's really hard. You have to like find a venue. It's like, it really isn't. It's really not that hard.
Yeah. And if you struggle with those kinds of things, you know, I'm sure you'll find someone else who's happy to help. Like, it really isn't. It really, there is no secret to publishing. That I want to make that so clear. It's like, you know, do it. You can do it yourself, and like really quite easily.
Yeah.
Great. Well, I would love to continue talking all night, but I think we have to conclude the session.
Indeed, that went very quickly.
It really did.
Nothing at all.
Sorry?
I feel like I said nothing at all, but
you said so much.
Okay.
And it was all great. So thank you so much for those who've tuned in. Thank you so much to Daniel. Please check out their work. Eternal Delight Paralysis is their most recently published book, and look out for their book to soon be published, Lavender Poems. A reminder that this session will be available on YouTube as a resource, and will be captured in the coming days if you'd like to revisit tonight's conversation. If you've enjoyed this as well, please check out our archive of Toolkits live talks on the Express Media YouTube, in the live tab and the Toolkits playlist. We have over 70 talks from previous Toolkits guests. Thanks, everybody. Cool. Have a wonderful night.